Tonight we journey to a realm where prayers fade, legends crumble, and even the immortal gods fall silent. Beneath the towering height of Olympus, the air feels different, as if reality itself bends more slowly here. You cannot see the summit clearly. It hides inside drifting clouds, heavy and watchful, like a thought that refuses to be spoken aloud. Something about this place feels unfinished. Not peaceful, not divine, unfinished. And in that unfinished silence, a question begins to form. Why does Zeus, king of all gods, listen so closely to things that have not yet happened? So before we continue tonight's journey, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy exploring these ancient stories together. And if you feel comfortable, share where you are listening from and what time it is, where you are in the world. The wind moves through the marble steps beneath your feet. Cold, patient, almost aware. You stand in a world where every breeze feels like a messenger. The temples above you are not just buildings. They are listening posts for something older than memory. And yet, there is no sound of war, no thunder, no command from the sky, only silence. Strangely, that is what feels most dangerous. You begin to hear fragments of stories from those who serve the gods, whispers carried by attendants in distant halls. They speak carefully, as if the air itself might repeat their words. They say Zeus has grown quiet in recent times. Not absent, not weakened, just watchful, as if waiting for something that has not yet chosen to reveal itself. Some say he stares too long at newborn gods. Others say he avoids certain prophecies entirely. And a few, very few, say he no longer smiles when children are born among the immortals. But myths rarely agree. Some traditions claim Zeus is simply burdened by rule. Others suggest something deeper, that even the ruler of Olympus fears what comes after him. You walk further along the stone path. Olive trees bend in the wind below the terraces, their leaves flickering like small green flames. Somewhere far beneath the cliffs, the sea strikes the rock in slow, endless rhythm. It sounds like time itself breaking apart and returning again. A priest passes you without speaking. His eyes do not meet yours. Instead, they remain fixed upward, always upward, as if the sky might answer him if he looks long enough. You realize something strange here. No one speaks Zeus's fear aloud, but everyone moves as if they know it exists. There is an omen told in the oldest versions of the tale, a version rarely spoken inside temples. It begins not with thunder, but with silence. On a night without moonlight, the sky above Olympus is said to have dimmed, not darkened, dimmed, as if something vast had briefly turned its attention away. And in that moment, the stars were no longer fixed. They shifted, just slightly, enough for those who read the heavens to notice, enough for Zeus to notice as well. From that night onward, he is said to have looked differently at the future, not as a path, but as a threat. You feel the temperature change as clouds gather above the mountain. The wind carries something unfamiliar now, not storm, not rain, but anticipation, as if the world is holding its breath. You try to imagine Zeus as others describe him, not the thunder-wielding ruler, not the figure carved into temples, but something more intimate, a being who remembers every prophecy spoken in fear. A being who knows that even divine children do not always obey the will of their parents. And that knowledge does not bring comfort. It brings caution. Somewhere in the upper halls of Olympus, Zeus is said to listen to silence itself. Not voices, not prayers, silence. Because silence to him is never empty. It is full of possibilities, full of futures not yet decided. And among those futures, there is one possibility he cannot ignore, the possibility of being replaced, not by enemies, but by his own children. You pause near a stone railing overlooking the abyss below Olympus. The world feels suspended here, between sky and earth, between certainty and unknown. A servant once described Zeus's gaze during moments like this, not angry, not afraid in the way mortals understand, but narrowed, as if he is trying to see something that exists just beyond perception, something that should not yet exist, but does. There is another tradition older and more unsettling. It suggests Zeus does not fear destruction. He has already survived that. He does not fear rebellion alone. That too has been faced. What he fears is succession, the quiet inevitability that every ruler eventually becomes a memory. And that memory in time becomes myth, and myth becomes something else entirely. You notice how the wind changes direction without warning. Cypress trees below sway in uneven rhythm, almost like hesitation. Even nature, it seems, does not move here without reason. And still the question lingers. What kind of fear can reach a god? Not fear of death, not fear of defeat, but fear of continuation, fear of what follows, fear of children not yet fully born into their purpose. A distant rumble echoes across the mountain. Not thunder, something softer, like stone adjusting under unseen weight. You feel it in your chest more than you hear it. And for a moment, it is easy to imagine Zeus himself pausing at that sound, not reacting, listening, always listening, as if the universe occasionally speaks in a language only he can partially understand. And somewhere within that silence, a prophecy is said to exist, one that no single temple agrees upon, one that shifts depending on who tells it. In some versions, Zeus's children bring balance. In others, they bring overthrow. In others still, they bring transformation so complete that even Olympus forgets its own name. But none of these versions are certain, and uncertainty in the world of gods is never harmless. You begin to understand the atmosphere of Olympus in a different way now. It is not ruled by thunder alone. It is ruled by anticipation, by what has not yet happened, and by what might already be inevitable. Far above you, hidden behind cloud and marble, Zeus listens, not to prayers, not to praise, but to the possibility of his own future unfolding without him. And for the first time in this journey, you sense the true weight of his presence. Not power, not authority, but awareness. The awareness that even immortality does not protect a god from what comes after. And as the wind slows, again settling into a strange, uneasy calm, one final thought drifts through the air like a distant omen. If even Zeus fears his own children, then what kind of future is already moving toward Olympus unseen and unstoppable? But destiny has not yet revealed its first answer, only its silence, only its waiting. And somewhere beyond the clouds, something begins to listen back. You remain beneath Olympus, but the silence has changed now. It is no longer empty. It feels occupied, as if something unseen has stepped closer, even though nothing has moved. The wind carries the scent of storm clouds gathering far beyond the horizon, though no storm has yet formed. You notice how even the priests walk differently today, slower, more careful, as if each step might disturb a fragile balance. And then, as if the mountain itself remembers what it once heard. The story continues. There is a moment deep within Zeus's memory that never fully fades. A moment spoken of in fragments, never in full. It begins with a warning, not from a god, but from something older than the Olympians' rule over sky and storm. A prophecy. You feel it as Zeus first felt it, not as words, but as weight. Heavy, unavoidable. A pressure that settles behind the eyes of the mind. It says this: the children of Zeus will one day challenge him. Not one child, but many, each carrying a different form of undoing. You try to imagine what it means to hear such a thing as a ruler of gods. To sit upon Olympus, surrounded by victory, and still feel something future-shaped pressing against your thoughts. Zeus does not panic. He does not tremble as mortals would. But something within him shifts, a subtle tightening, like thunder forming far too early inside a clear sky. Some traditions say the prophecy came from Gaia herself. Others say it came from voices deep beneath the world, where even gods do not walk freely. A few whisper that Zeus already knew it before it was spoken aloud. That prophecy is never truly revealed, only confirmed, but scholars of myth still debate this. Some argue it is a later interpretation added to justify his actions. Others insist the fear is too precise to be invention. Either way, the consequence remains the same. Zeus begins to look at time differently. You walk through a terrace of polished stone, where offerings still smoke faintly in bronze bowls. The smoke rises upward in twisting shapes, then breaks apart in the wind. Even here, you feel the tension between what is offered and what is expected in return. Because now even offerings feel uncertain. as if the gods themselves are unsure what future they are feeding. Zeus is no longer only king, he is observer, and what he observes most closely is continuity. Children are no longer simply joy. They are questions. Each birth becomes a possibility that branches into unknown futures. And in those futures, Zeus sees something he cannot tolerate. A world without him at its center. In one version of the myth, Zeus hears the prophecy while lightning fractures the sky. In another, it arrives quietly spoken by a hidden voice during a feast where even laughter pauses mid-air. And in another still, it is not spoken at all. It is simply understood, as if existence itself briefly turns toward him and says nothing, except inevitability. You feel a strange distance growing between Zeus and the idea of joy. Not hatred, not rejection, distance. Because joy, once touched by prophecy, becomes complicated. Even a child's laugh may now carry echoing futures. Even a newborn's breath may feel like the beginning of something irreversible. The first time Zeus becomes a father, the world does not change. But he does. Not outwardly, not in visible ways, but inwardly, like a shift in the foundation of a mountain. You are told he watches the child longer than expected, not with cruelty, but with calculation, as if trying to see not what the child is, but what the child might become. Some attendants claim he smiled once, just once, then quickly stopped, as if the act itself had revealed too much vulnerability. Others say he never smiled at all. That memory, like all divine memory, depends on who survives to tell it. The prophecy does not say all children will destroy him immediately. That is the cruel part. It leaves space. Space for uncertainty, space for delay, space for inevitability. And that space is where Zeus begins to live. You notice how Olympus itself seems to reflect this tension. Temples appear brighter in the morning light, but colder at dusk. Offerings are still made, but more carefully, more cautiously. Even the gods, in their distant ways, begin to adjust around Zeus's unseen burden. There is a dream Zeus is said to experience repeatedly, a dream that never fully resolves. In it, he stands upon a throne made of cloud and lightning. Below him, the world continues as it always has. But above him, children gather. Not hostile, not violent, just present, watching, waiting. And in that dream, Zeus cannot tell whether they are approaching to take his place, or to ask permission to become something greater than he ever was. This uncertainty is what unsettles him most. Not rebellion, not war, but interpretation. Because prophecy does not speak clearly, it only suggests. And suggestion is more dangerous than certainty. You walk further along the path and notice how distant thunder rolls across the sky though no storm has formed. It feels like memory trying to become weather. And in that moment, you understand something subtle about Zeus's fear. It is not fear of destruction. It is fear of succession without understanding. Fear that his children will not destroy him, but replace him in ways he cannot comprehend. Some traditions say Zeus tries to resist this fate through control. Others say he accepts it, but delays it. And others still claim he attempts something more extreme, to prevent the future entirely, not by destroying it, but by swallowing uncertainty itself before it can grow. Scholars debate what this means, whether it is literal, symbolic, or simply the imagination of later storytellers trying to explain divine behavior that feels too human. But in every version, one truth remains consistent. Zeus listens more carefully than before. To laughter, to silence, to prophecy, to children, to himself. And somewhere within that listening fear takes root. Not loud, not dramatic, but persistent, like a second heartbeat beneath the first. You look up toward Olympus again. The peak is still hidden, but now it feels closer, heavier, as if the mountain is leaning inward, listening with you. And in that shared silence, you realize something unsettling. Zeus is not afraid of his children because they are strong. He's afraid because they are uncertain. And uncertainty is the one force even gods cannot fully command. A final image settles in your mind as the wind slows. A father looking at his future, not with hatred, not with pride, but with the quiet understanding that what he has created may not belong to him at all. And somewhere beyond Olympus, time itself continues moving forward, towards something even Zeus cannot yet name, but destiny has already begun to shape it, silently, patiently, unstoppably. You feel the mountains shift into a quieter mood now, as if Olympus itself is remembering something it would rather forget. The wind softens, the light dims slightly, even though no cloud passes overhead. And in that subtle change, your attention is drawn away from Zeus for the first time, towards someone else. A presence moving through the same world, but under a very different weight. Rhea, you do not see her at first. You feel her, like a memory pressed into stone, like grief that has learned how to walk without making sound. She moves through halls that once echoed with laughter of younger gods, though those sounds have long since faded into myth. And yet, something remains here. A tension, a quiet resistance against fate. In some traditions, Rhea is called the Mother of Gods. But titles mean little when you stand beside her in this moment. What you notice instead is what she carries. Not just children, not just memory, but awareness. Awareness of what prophecy demands. And awareness of what a mother is asked to sacrifice in response. You walk behind her through a corridor of pale stone. Torches burn low their flames, bending slightly as she passes, as if even fire hesitates in her presence. The air smells faintly of oil and crushed herbs, used in temple rituals, meant to protect newborn divinity. But protection is a fragile word here, almost ironic. There is a version of the story where Rhea hears the prophecy before Zeus fully accepts it. Another, where she learns it only after witnessing the fear in Kronos before him. And another older still where she understands it without being told at all, as if motherhood itself carries knowledge older than prophecy. You begin to understand something unsettling about her silence. It is not ignorance. It is containment. She is holding something inside herself so large, it threatens to reshape everything around her. And still she walks forward, step by step, as if movement itself is a form of resistance. You notice the absence first. The absence of sound from children who should be present, from infants who should be crying within sacred chambers, from voices that should echo through divine halls. Instead, there is only silence, carefully constructed silence. Some traditions say Rhea hides her children, others say she loses them, others still insist she never truly gives them up at all, but places them somewhere beyond the reach of time itself. Scholars continue to debate whether this is literal geography or symbolic mythology, but standing here, you feel something more immediate, loss and protection, existing at the same time. You follow her into a chamber carved into the mountain itself. Cold stone, no ornamentation, only stillness. At the center, faint offerings rest untouched. Milk, honey, woven cloth, symbols of life that feel strangely fragile in such a place. Rhea pauses. For the first time, she does not move forward. And in that pause, you sense everything she refuses to say. Because she knows. She knows what prophecy demands. And she knows what Zeus will eventually do in response to it. Not out of cruelty, but out of fear that has not yet learned its limits. There is a story whispered among older priestesses that Rhea once begged Gaia for counsel, not for power, not for victory, but for something far smaller, a way to let children exist without becoming threats to time itself. The answer she receives is never fully recorded. Only fragments remain, and even those fragments disagree. Some say Gaia told her that destiny cannot be avoided, only delayed. Others say she told her that every generation replaces the one before it, whether violently or gently. And a few insist Gaia said nothing at all. That silence was the only answer given. You feel the weight of that possibility here. Silence as instruction, silence as prophecy, silence as inevitability. Rhea lowers her hand to the stone floor, and for a moment the chamber feels warmer, not physically, emotionally, as if memory itself is trying to soften what comes next. In one version of the myth, this is where Rhea makes her decision, not in anger, not in rebellion, but in grief that has reached its limit. A choice not about power, but about survival of something fragile within divine order. You notice how her breathing changes. Slow, measured, controlled, as if even breath must not betray what she is thinking. because what she is thinking cannot be spoken aloud in Olympus. Not safely, not without consequence. You begin to understand the core tension of her existence. She is mother to gods who will reshape the world. And yet, she is also bound to a world that fears what those gods might become. There is a prophecy that echoes here too, different from Zeus's version, older, less precise. It suggests that children born of divine union will always exceed the boundaries set for them, not necessarily in destruction, but in transformation. And transformation to those in power often feels like danger. You step closer to the chamber wall. Carved into it are faint markings, not declarations, not prayers, but repetitions, patterns, as if someone once tried to understand fate by writing it over and over again until meaning emerged. It never did, at least not in a way anyone agrees upon. Rhea turns slightly, and for the first time you sense her not as a mythic figure, but as someone standing between impossible choices, a mother, a goddess, a keeper of futures she cannot fully control. There is a tradition that says she cries only once, not openly, not dramatically, but silently, in a place where even sound would not survive long, and that single moment becomes the emotional origin of many later myths. Though historians of mythology continue to debate whether such specificity is symbolic rather than literal memory, you realize something important here. Rhea's silence is not absence. It is resistance without noise, a refusal to allow prophecy to fully define her actions, even when every path leads through it. And somewhere far beyond this chamber, Zeus continues to grow into his understanding of fear, not knowing yet that beneath Olympus another consciousness is also wrestling with the same future, but from a very different direction. Rhea lifts her gaze toward the unseen ceiling of the mountain, as if she can feel the weight of the sky above her, as if she knows that even gods are watched by forces they do not fully understand. In some interpretations, this is where the earliest fracture between divine generations begins. Not war, not betrayal, but difference in response. Zeus reacts with control, Rhea responds with concealment, both shaped by the same prophecy, both unable to escape its shadow. You stand in silence with her for a moment longer, and you begin to feel it too. The strange truth beneath all divine stories, that prophecy does not merely predict. It shapes behavior, it creates fear before action, and sometimes it becomes the very thing it warns against. Rhea turns away from the chamber and begins to walk again, but now her steps feel different. Not lighter, not heavier, but resolved in a way that does not require explanation. As you follow her out, the torches seem brighter, or perhaps your eyes have simply adjusted to the darkness. Either way, something has changed, not resolved, not concluded, but shifted. And somewhere within Olympus, far above and yet intimately connected to this silence, Zeus continues listening to futures that have not yet arrived, unaware that beneath him, a mother has already begun shaping the first quiet resistance against destiny itself. But destiny, as always, is not finished speaking. It is only pausing, only waiting, only preparing its next movement. You leave Rhea's silence behind, but it does not leave you. It lingers in the air as you ascend again through the lower paths of Olympus, where stone steps grow warmer beneath unseen sunlight, and the wind begins to carry a sharper edge. There is a feeling here now, something tightening, like a story reaching the moment where it can no longer remain uncertain. And ahead of you, the shape of Kronos begins to emerge. You are not yet standing in war, not yet in rebellion. You are in the space before it where decisions are still disguised as survival. The air tastes faintly metallic like rain that has not yet fallen, and every sound feels slightly delayed, as if the world itself is waiting for permission to continue. Kronos is often remembered as a tyrant, a god who devoured his children, a symbol of fear turned into action, but myths rarely agree on why fear begins. And here, in this suspended moment, you begin to understand something more unsettling. Kronos is not only a monster in these stories, he is a reaction, a response to prophecy already spoken into existence. You stand at the edge of a vast hall carved from ancient stone. No light enters here naturally, only torchlight flickering like unstable memory. And within that glow you sense him, not yet fully seen, but present in every shadow. Some traditions say Kronos learned the prophecy from Gaia. Others say it came from Uranus's lingering voice beneath the world. A few claim it was not spoken at all, but discovered like a truth hidden inside the structure of reality itself. And once known, it cannot be unknown. The prophecy is simple in its cruelty. One of his children will overthrow him. Not might, will. And that certainty is what breaks something inside him long before any action begins. You notice how the hall feels different now, less like a place of rule, more like a place of prevention, as if every stone has been placed not for beauty, but for containment. Containment of time, containment of future, containment of uncertainty. Kronos begins his decision slowly, not in rage, but in calculation. You can almost feel the logic forming around him like cold armor. If the future contains betrayal, then the future must be controlled. If children contain prophecy, then children must be contained as well. But even gods cannot contain time without consequence. You see the first act not as violence, but as necessity in his mind. A moment where love and fear collapse into the same motion. A child is born, and Kronos does not hesitate. He swallows them, not because he hates them, but because he believes he is preventing something worse. And here, in the mythology interpretation fractures, some traditions say the children survive within him, conscious and aware. Others say they are dissolved into divine essence. Others still insist they enter a kind of suspended existence, neither alive nor gone. Historians of myth continue to debate whether this is literal cosmology or symbolic reflection of ancient fear. But what remains consistent is the horror of containment. You feel it now, not as violence alone, but as distortion of natural order. Time swallowing its own future, a father becoming the boundary of his children's existence. And yet, even this act does not resolve fear. It only postpones it. Because prophecy once spoken adapts, it does not disappear. It waits for another path. You notice how the air inside Kronos' hall feels heavier with each child's absence. Not empty, compressed, as if reality itself is being folded inward. And somewhere deep within that compression, something resists. Rhea's silence echoes here too. Not as agreement, but as contradiction. Because she has not surrendered everything. Not fully. Not yet. There is a version of the myth where Rhea tricks Kronos. A stone wrapped in cloth. A substitution born from grief and desperation. A deception that feels both tragic and necessary. And Kronos swallows it without question. You stand in that moment now. The instant where illusion becomes survival, and survival becomes consequence. The stone enters Kronos, and the world does not react immediately. There is no thunder, no collapse, only a subtle pause, as if reality itself is uncertain how to respond. Then something changes, not visibly, but structurally, like a thread pulled too tightly inside the fabric of divine order. Kronos believes he has secured the future. But what he has actually done is deepen the tension within it. Because prophecy does not vanish when ignored. It sharpens. You feel a strange distance forming between action and outcome, between intention and result, between fear and understanding. And in that distance, the future begins to breathe. Quietly, patiently, unseen. Some oral traditions say Kronos begins to hear faint sounds afterward. Not voices, not cries, but possibilities, as if time itself is leaking through the act he thought would contain it. Others suggest he becomes more vigilant, watching every detail, every shadow, every movement of his remaining children, as if control can still be achieved through attention alone. But attention cannot reverse what has already been set in motion. You begin to understand the tragedy forming here, not of evil, but of certainty mistaken for solution. Because Kronos believes he is preventing prophecy. But what he is actually doing is defining the conditions for its fulfillment. And somewhere beyond this hall, unseen and untouched by this act, Zeus continues to exist. Not yet in full awareness, not yet in confrontation, but already shaped by what has been done to protect him. You feel the narrative tightening again. The consequences not arriving immediately, but accumulating. Like storm clouds gathering far beyond visible horizon, and as Kronos remains in his belief of control, something else begins to form in the silence left behind. Not rebellion yet, not war, but continuity, the kind that prophecy always preserves. The stone rests inside him, and the world continues, but never quite in the same way again, because now even in stillness something is waiting to be born, and destiny has not yet revealed what form it will take, only that it will, eventually, unavoidably. You leave the swallowing silence of Kronos behind, but it does not fully release you. It follows like a shadow beneath thought. And as you move away from that older world of fear and containment, the air of Olympus begins to feel different again. Lighter, but not safe. Never safe. It feels like something has been removed from the center of the world, leaving a space that time itself does not yet know how to fill. And in that space, Zeus is growing. You do not find him on Olympus. Not yet. He is elsewhere, hidden in the folds of myth where divine childhood is not recorded clearly, but only hinted at through fragments. A mountain cave in some traditions, a distant valley in others, or a sacred island where the sea speaks more than the sky. The location changes, but the feeling does not. Exile. You step into that hidden place as if crossing a threshold inside memory itself. The wind here is softer, but carries a strange electricity, like storm energy held too long beneath skin. The rocks are damp with condensation, and olive trees twist in shapes shaped more by wind than intention. And somewhere within this quiet landscape, Zeus learns how to exist without being seen. He is not yet the thunder god you know from temples, not yet the ruler of Olympus. Here he is, simply something becoming, a presence that has not chosen its final form. And that is what makes him dangerous to fate itself. Some traditions say Rhea placed him here in secret. Others say Gaia herself hid him. A few insist the world hid him on its own, as if reality refused to let prophecy complete itself too early. Historians of myth debate whether exile is physical or symbolic. But standing here you feel something unmistakable. He is separated from consequence. For now, you hear water moving through stone channels nearby, cold, constant, unaware of what it carries forward. And in that sound, you begin to sense Zeus's earliest awareness of time, not as sequence, but as pressure. There are spirits here in some versions of the myth, ancient caretakers, divine nurses, protective forces that do not speak in language but in instinct. They do not teach Zeus morality, they teach him restraint. And restraint in a being destined for power is its own kind of tension. You watch him grow without the world watching back. And that changes everything, because power when observed becomes performance. But power in isolation becomes something else entirely. It becomes internalized, refined, hardened. There is a story told in fragments. Zeus as a child standing beneath storm clouds that are not yet his, listening, not commanding, listening, as if trying to understand what thunder is before it belongs to him. And sometimes the sky answers, not with words, but with distant vibration, a low resonance that travels through stone and bone alike. And Zeus learns to recognize it, not as fear, but as familiarity. You begin to notice something subtle in his growth. He does not react like other divine children described in myth. He does not simply play or wander. He observes, always observes, as if the world is something he is preparing to negotiate with later. Some oral traditions suggest he is taught survival through hidden lessons. Others suggest he learns through witnessing imbalance in nature. And a few interpretations claim there are no teachers at all, only environment shaping awareness. You feel the emotional weight of that uncertainty. Because even here, even in exile, prophecy is present. Not spoken, but implied. Always implied. Zeus is said to experience dreams during this period. Not prophetic dreams yet, but formative ones. Dreams where the sky fractures into branching paths, where voices call him forward but never identify themselves, where he stands at the edge of something vast and unfinished. And in those dreams, there is always a sensation, not of danger, but of expectation, as if something larger than him is waiting for him to become complete. You walk through the valley now with him, bare feet on cool stone, wind moving through tall grasses that bend without resistance. And above the sky feels unusually attentive. There is a mythic image here that persists across versions. A young Zeus holding a bolt of lightning for the first time, not as weapon, but as recognition, as if something within him finally aligns with something within the world. Some say this moment is natural, others say it is inevitable, and a few insist it is accidental, that lightning simply responds to potential, not identity. But regardless of interpretation, something changes. A boundary is crossed, quietly, irreversibly. You feel it as a shift in tone, as if the world has acknowledged something it can no longer ignore. Zeus is no longer only hidden, he is becoming defined. And definition in myth is always the beginning of consequence. You notice how the wind begins to behave differently around him, not violently, but attentively, as if even air adjusts its expectations. There is still no Olympus, no throne, no war, only preparation disguised as silence. But beneath that silence, something is building. A tension between what Zeus is allowed to become and what prophecy suggests he must eventually face. Some versions of the myth say he begins to ask questions, not about identity, but about control, about why some forces rise while others fall, about whether destiny can be negotiated or only endured. And no answer comes clearly, only ambiguity, only signs, only patterns that never fully resolve. You begin to understand something important about Zeus here. His fear does not begin in adulthood. It is inherited, absorbed, internalized long before he understands its source. Because somewhere above him, Kronos still exists. And somewhere behind him, Rhea still remembers. And somewhere ahead, prophecy continues to unfold without permission. The hidden thunder inside him is not yet fear, not yet power. It is potential held under restraint. And that restraint is what makes him watchful, even as a child, even in safety, even in exile. And as the valley grows quieter in the fading light, you realize something unsettling. Zeus is not being raised away from fate. He's being shaped by it in absence. And absence in myth is never empty. It is preparation. The wind slows, the grasses settle, and somewhere far beyond this hidden place, unseen forces continue to move toward convergence. Not yet conflict, not yet revelation, but inevitability gathering shape. And Zeus, still hidden from Olympus, still untouched by rule, still unclaimed by throne, continues listening to the sky, as if it is already speaking to him. And he is beginning to understand that one day he will answer. You leave the hidden valley behind, but the feeling of becoming does not fade. It follows you upward into higher air, where the sky begins to feel less like a ceiling and more like a battlefield waiting for permission to begin. Something ancient is shifting now, not loudly, not yet, but decisively, like stone cracking beneath invisible pressure. And Zeus is no longer hidden. You stand at the edge of a world that is about to remember itself differently. The myths call it war, but it begins long before the first strike. It begins in awareness, in recognition, in the moment when exile becomes return, and return becomes confrontation. Zeus does not arrive on Olympus as a conqueror at first. He arrives as necessity, a presence the world can no longer ignore. Some say he appears suddenly fully formed by destiny. Others insist his rise is gradual, shaped by alliances and hidden preparation. Historians of myth continue to debate whether his ascent is divine intervention or narrative condensation of long unseen struggle. But what remains consistent is inevitability. You feel the gathering of forces before you see them. The air thickens with expectation. Clouds move differently now, less like weather, more like thought. And beneath them, the older gods begin to stir. The Titans are not yet fully fallen, not yet erased from power. They remain vast, ancient, and certain of their place in existence. Their strength is not only physical, it is structural. They believe the world is complete as it is, and anything new is disruption. But disruption is already walking toward them. Zeus is no longer alone. That is the first change. He gathers allies not through command, but through recognition. Those who feel out of place in the older order begin to move toward him, not in rebellion at first, but in resonance. Some traditions speak of divine craftsmen who forge weapons not meant for destruction alone, but for balance. Others speak of imprisoned beings who are freed not out of mercy but necessity. and a few whisper that the world itself begins choosing sides long before gods acknowledge it. You walk beside Zeus now, though the myths never fully describe the path he takes. It is not straight. It is not visible. It is formed through decisions that later become legend. Every alliance carries tension. Every promise carries consequence. Nothing here is simple. Nothing here is without cost. And still, Zeus advances, not with certainty, but with understanding that something must shift for existence to continue evolving. There is a moment before the first war fully begins, a quiet pause, where both sides feel the approaching fracture of reality. The Titans feel it as instability. Zeus feels it as necessity. Neither fully understands the other's interpretation of the same inevitability. And you begin to notice something profound. Even gods experience hesitation before transformation. Even immortals feel the weight of irreversible change. The sky darkens not with storm, but with alignment, as if multiple layers of existence are briefly overlapping. Mountains feel closer, oceans feel deeper, time feels less linear, and then movement begins. Not chaos, not yet, but initiation. The first strikes are not described clearly in surviving traditions. Some say they are lightning, others say they are seismic shifts in reality itself, and others insist they are symbolic representations of cosmic restructuring rather than literal combat. But what matters is not form, it is consequence. Because once the conflict begins, the world no longer feels static. It becomes directional. It begins moving towards something new. You feel Zeus in this moment more than you see him, not as rage, not as dominance, but as focus, a narrowing of all possibility into action. There is fear here, but it is not hesitation. It is awareness of scale, of what is being altered, of what cannot be undone once begun. And somewhere within him, something older than thought whispers. If order is not challenged, it becomes stagnation. If stagnation continues, it becomes collapse. The Titans respond not with panic, but certainty. They believe stability is truth, and truth does not yield. This is where the war becomes more than conflict. It becomes philosophy made physical. You stand between these forces now, even though no mortal could truly survive such proximity. But myth does not obey physical limitation. It obeys meaning. Lightning fractures the upper sky for the first time, not as single strike, but as language, as declaration, as transition. The air vibrates with something deeper than sound, something that feels like the world acknowledging a new structure forming within itself. And Zeus, for the first time in his unfolding identity, is not only reacting to prophecy, he is shaping it. Some interpretations suggest this is the moment he first understands leadership. Others say it is the moment he first understands consequence. And a few insist it is the moment he realizes fear and responsibility are the same sensations seen from different angles. You watch alliances solidify around him, not through domination, but through necessity. Because even the world recognizes imbalance when it becomes too large to ignore. And yet nothing here is clean. Nothing here is purely justified. Every action carries future echoes. Every victory creates future tension. This is the hidden truth of divine war. It does not end conflict. It redistributes it. You feel the turning point approaching, not final victory, but structural change. And Zeus, standing at the center of this unfolding transformation, is no longer simply a child of prophecy. He is now a participant in shaping it. The sky opens in places it should not open. Time seems to hesitate between moments. And for an instant, everything feels like it is listening, not to commands, not to prayers, but to what kind of world will exist after this moment passes. And the answer is not yet given, only the beginning of one. You remain inside the aftermath of movement that still has not fully settled. The sky above Olympus no longer feels neutral. It feels negotiated, as if reality itself has begun accepting that something older is being questioned. And something new is refusing to remain hidden. The war has not ended, but it has changed shape. And in that change, Zeus is no longer only a participant. He is becoming a force that other forces must respond to. You walk through a fractured landscape of divine consequence. Not destruction in the mortal sense, but imbalance made visible. Mountains seem slightly misaligned with the horizon. Rivers feel redirected as if their memory of direction has been disturbed. Even the wind carries hesitation now, as though it is unsure which version of the world it belongs to. The Titans are still present, but no longer unified in certainty. Their strength remains immense, ancient, unchallenged by time. Yet something unfamiliar begins to touch them. Not weakness, but resistance. The world is no longer agreeing with them in the same way. Zeus stands at the center of this shift, though he does not yet claim it fully. You sense him moving through decisions that are no longer purely reactive. Each choice begins to carry weight beyond the present moment. Each action begins to echo further forward than even he can see. There is a version of the myth where the conflict is not sudden, but gradual, a slow unraveling of an older cosmic structure that once felt permanent. Historians of myth suggest this reflects how ancient cultures understood generational change, not as instant overthrow, but as accumulated pressure. Still, even accumulation can feel like sudden collapse when the final threshold is crossed. You begin to see what chains mean here. Not only physical binding, but conceptual limitation. The Titans are described as chained not simply in defeat, but in symbolic containment of an older worldview. A worldview where order is fixed, where hierarchy is eternal, where time does not question itself. Zeus does not yet define himself as judge, but others begin to see him that way. Those who stand with him interpret his actions as restoration. Those who stand against him interpret them as disruption. And somewhere between those interpretations, truth becomes harder to locate. You notice how relationships begin to shift, not just between gods and titans, but within the divine community itself. Alliances that once seemed stable begin to show strain under pressure of interpretation. Even agreement becomes conditional. Hera observes from distance in some versions, not yet fully aligned, not yet fully opposed, but watching, always watching, as if trying to determine whether Zeus is restoring balance or redefining it entirely. And Zeus himself, he listens more than he speaks. That is what begins to define him here. Listening, measuring, adjusting, as if every force around him is a language he's still learning to interpret correctly. You feel the emergence of something new within him. Not certainty, not authority, but responsibility that has not yet been fully named. A sense that actions now extend beyond intention, that consequences are no longer immediate. They are layered, delayed, distributed across time itself. There is an omen described in fragments, a moment when the sky briefly stops reflecting light in its usual way. Not darkness, not eclipse, but distortion, as if reality is briefly unsure how to display itself. Some say this occurs when divine order transitions between dominant structures. Others suggest it is symbolic interpretation of mythic transition rather than literal event. But the feeling remains consistent. The world is changing its internal agreement. You stand near a great boundary point where forces once considered absolute begin to lose clarity. Even the Titans in their oldest depictions are no longer purely unchallenged. They are becoming defined by resistance they did not anticipate. And Zeus begins to understand something uncomfortable. Victory does not remove fear. It redistributes it. Because every chain placed upon an older force creates tension elsewhere. Every act of containment generates new questions about what comes next. And prophecy once again refuses to remain silent. You sense the turning point forming deeper within the myth. Not yet resolution, but recognition that structure itself is no longer stable. The old gods are not simply being defeated. They are being recontextualized. And in that recontextualization, Zeus begins to face something more complex than enemies. He faces consequence, not as punishment, but as continuity. There is a quiet moment within the unfolding war where Zeus pauses, not from hesitation, but from awareness, as if he has briefly seen how far forward his actions extend, how many futures begin to bend in response. Some traditions say this is where he first understands leadership not as power, but as burden. Others say it is where he realizes that even victory requires interpretation. And a few insist this is the moment fear returns not as avoidance, but as clarity. You feel the chains of the Titans not as endpoint, but as transition, something being contained, so something else can emerge without collapsing under contradiction. And still nothing here feels complete, because containment is never final in myth. It is only temporary arrangement of forces still in motion. Zeus stands within that motion now, not above it, not outside it, inside it, and somewhere beyond Olympus, beyond war, beyond even memory of current events. Something begins to shift again, not loudly, not visibly, but inevitably, because every chain placed upon the past becomes pressure upon the future, and the future, as always, has not yet finished deciding what it will become. You feel the war begin to slow but not end. It changes its rhythm, like a storm that has moved past its first strike and now settles into something longer, more patient, more inevitable. Olympus is no longer simply a place above the world. It has become a center of decisions that will outlast the gods who make them. And in that center, Zeus begins to speak less to others and more to fate itself. You stand within a hall carved from pale stone where echoes linger longer than words. Every sound here feels preserved, as if the building itself remembers everything said within it. Torches burn with steady flame, but even their light feels restrained, controlled, measured. Nothing here is accidental anymore. Zeus is not surrounded by celebration. Not yet. Not fully. Instead, there is something closer to consolidation, a gathering of forces that have survived the first rupture of cosmic order. Those who remain now understand something important. The world will not return to what it was. You watch as allies stand at varying distances from him, not in unity yet, but in alignment, each one still carrying their own interpretation of what this new order should become. And Zeus stands at the center of interpretations that have not yet agreed with one another. There is a moment in myth where leadership stops being conquest and becomes maintenance. This is that moment beginning to form, quietly, without announcement. Some traditions say Zeus speaks an oath here. Others say it is not spoken aloud at first, but formed internally before it ever reaches language. And a few claim it is not Zeus who creates it, but the collective necessity of those gathered around him. You hear it as if it is being shaped in real time, not a single sentence, but a structure of intention, a promise to preserve order, to prevent collapse, to maintain balance between forces that would otherwise undo each other. But every oath in mythology carries dual meaning. It is both protection and limitation, both commitment and constraint. And Zeus, even as he forms it, seems aware of this duality. You notice how silence deepens as he prepares to speak. Not dramatic silence, not theatrical pause, but a silence that feels like pressure building beneath stone. When the oath is spoken, it does not feel like declaration. It feels like alignment, as if reality itself adjusts slightly to accommodate what has been stated. Some versions describe it as a promise to uphold cosmic order. Others describe it as a declaration of kingship over sky and storm. And others still suggest it is an acknowledgement that power without structure collapses into chaos. Historians of myth continue to debate whether Zeus is asserting control or accepting responsibility. The difference is subtle, but in divine terms, it changes everything. You begin to feel the consequences of the oath immediately, not in visible change, but in relational tension. Every god present now exists within a defined expectation. Even freedom becomes structured under implication. Hera observes this shift carefully, not approving, not rejecting, but measuring, as if she is trying to determine whether Zeus is becoming stability or simply a new version of uncertainty. And somewhere beyond the hall, beyond Olympus, beyond even the visible war, the Titans remain present in absence. Their containment is not silence, it is suspended consequence. And everyone in this hall knows it. You feel the weight of responsibility settle deeper into Zeus now. He is no longer only acting within conflict. He is now defining what comes after it. And what comes after always carries greater uncertainty than war itself. There is a tradition that says this oath is what separates Zeus from earlier divine rulers. Not strength, not victory, but the decision to maintain order after chaos has already begun. But even order once defined begins to create new tensions, because order requires enforcement, and enforcement requires interpretation, and interpretation over time becomes disagreement. You watch as Zeus's gaze moves across those gathered, not as conqueror, but as observer of potential futures. Each being here represents a different path the world could take, and for the first time you sense something beneath his authority, not insecurity, but awareness of scale, the understanding that ruling does not simplify reality, it multiplies it. There is a quiet moment after the oath where no one speaks, not because nothing remains to say, but because everything has already shifted. Some say this is where Zeus becomes truly king, others say this is where he becomes burdened, and a few argue that kingship and burden are identical in divine context. You step back from the hall, feeling its echo linger in your thoughts, because words spoken here do not remain contained. They expand, they influence structure, they reshape expectation itself. And Zeus now carries not only the outcome of war, but the maintenance of what war has produced. Far away, unseen by those within Olympus, time continues to adjust itself, not forward or backward, but around the shape of what has just been declared. And somewhere in that adjustment, a deeper question begins to form, one that even Zeus does not yet fully articulate. What happens when the protector of order becomes the source of it? The oath still echoes, not in sound, but in consequence, and consequence is always in myth, does not end. It continues, quietly, relentlessly, beyond the moment it was created. You feel the story soften here, as if Olympus itself is inhaling after a long divided breath. The war is no longer the only presence shaping the world. Something else has entered the silence it left behind. Not destruction, not rebellion, but continuation. And continuation in the world of gods is always more complicated than it first appears. You stand within the higher halls of Olympus, where light filters through marble columns like pale water. Everything feels newly arranged, as if reality has been subtly reorganized around the consequences of Zeus's oath. There is order now, but it is not peaceful order. It is maintained order, and maintained things always carry tension beneath their surface. Zeus is no longer only a warrior, no longer only a negotiator of cosmic imbalance. He is now something closer to a foundation, a fixed point around which other divine forces begin to orient themselves. And yet, even fixed points can feel uncertainty. It begins quietly, a shift in attention, a subtle change in how the world responds to Zeus's presence. Not fear, not reverence alone, but expectation, as if something is waiting to be seen through him. You hear it first in fragments of conversation among divine attendants. A child has been born, a child of Zeus, and the name is spoken with a mixture of awe and hesitation, as if language itself is unsure how to carry it safely. There are different accounts of this moment. Some say Zeus feels immediate joy. Others say he feels silence before anything else. And a few traditions suggest he feels something far more complex, recognition of inevitability, as if this moment has already occurred somewhere outside time. You're drawn toward the child, not as event, but as emotional shift. Because in myth, children of gods are never only individuals, they are projections of future possibility. And Zeus watches, not as detached ruler, not as distant force, but as presence suddenly confronted by something deeply personal. There's no single agreement in ancient sources about his reaction. Some say he smiles briefly, then turns away as if hiding vulnerability. Others insist he remains entirely composed, his expression unreadable as storm clouds held in suspension. And others suggest he lingers longer than expected, as if trying to understand what kind of future has just been introduced into his domain. You begin to feel something subtle forming within him, not fear yet, but awareness of continuity, because children are not endings, they are extensions, and extensions always carry unknown direction. The child is described in myth as radiant in some versions, in others unusually still, in others still already marked by symbolic traits that later cultures would interpret as divine inheritance. But what remains consistent is this: the child does not feel small. Even in infancy, something larger is implied. Zeus approaches in silence, and the air around him changes, not violently, but attentively, as if the world itself is adjusting its perception of what this interaction means. You feel the moment stretch, not long, but dense, like time refusing to pass at normal speed. There is a mythic tension here that cannot be resolved immediately, because Zeus is no longer only defined by prophecy. He is now also defined by participation in creation, and creation, once it begins, does not stop asking questions. Some traditions say this is where Zeus first experiences dual emotion, joy and fear existing simultaneously without cancelling each other. Others suggest he feels responsibility deepen beyond war into something quieter, and a few interpretations propose something more unsettling, that he sees himself reflected in the child, not as he is, but as he might become in future repetition. You notice how carefully he stands, as if even movement might alter something irreversible. There is a version of the myth where this child is Athena, born from Zeus's mind in a later symbolic transformation. But in earlier layers of tradition, the identity is less fixed, and that ambiguity itself becomes part of the story. Because what matters is not only who the child is, but what the child represents. Zeus has fought titans. He has bound ancient forces. He has sworn oaths that reshape cosmic structure. But none of those acts required this kind of stillness. Here, power does not act. It observes. It receives. It interprets. And in that interpretation, something new forms inside Zeus. A tension between protector and creator, between order and inheritance, between fear and continuity. You feel Hera's presence in this moment too, though not directly described, because relationships do not pause during divine events. They evolve beneath them. And Hera, in many traditions, begins to recognize that Zeus's fear is no longer abstract. It is intimate. Some versions of the myth suggest this is where jealousy begins to transform into understanding. Others say it becomes sharper. And historians continue to debate whether Hera's perspective is opposition or reflection. But none of that changes the central truth of this moment. A child exists, and existence creates future. Zeus remains still, long enough that silence itself begins to feel like dialogue. And then slowly something within him shifts, not resolution, not acceptance, but recalibration, as if he is learning how to hold both love and consequence in the same thought. You begin to understand something fundamental about Zeus here. His fear is not diminishing. It is expanding into responsibility. And responsibility in divine terms is never light. The child's presence changes Olympus subtly, not through action, but through implication, because now the future is not only something Zeus prevents, it is something he also produces. And somewhere beyond this moment, beyond this hall, beyond even mythic clarity, prophecy continues to adjust itself around this new reality, because prophecy does not stop at prediction, it adapts to participation. Zeus finally turns away, not in rejection, but in thought, as if carrying something too large to express immediately. And as you follow him, you realize the war that once defined him is no longer the central axis of his existence. It has been replaced by something quieter, something more persistent, something that does not end with victory, continuity. And in that continuity, a new kind of fear begins to form. Not fear of overthrow, but fear of succession, fear of repetition, fear that what has been begun will continue beyond control. The child remains behind him, unaware, unmeasured, already part of a future Zeus cannot fully contain. And Olympus, for the first time since the war began, feels not like a battlefield, but like a beginning that refuses to settle into final form. You feel the air above Olympus change again, but this time it is not the pressure of war. It is something quieter, stranger, as if thought itself has begun to take shape in the world. The marble halls no longer feel like architecture alone. They feel like a vessel waiting for something to be born that does not belong to ordinary birth at all. And Zeus begins to carry a silence that is different from before. Not fear, not hesitation, but compression, as if something within him is building toward a point that cannot remain internal. You walk beside him through the upper terraces of Olympus, where clouds drift low enough to brush against stone. The wind here carries no urgency, only inevitability. And somewhere in that stillness, Zeus begins to feel it, not a prophecy spoken, not a warning delivered, but something inside his own awareness shifting shape. There are versions of the myth that disagree on everything that follows. Some say Zeus feels a piercing headache that lasts days. Others describe a sudden clarity that isolates him from all distraction. And a few traditions suggest there is no pain at all, only realization. But all versions converge on one truth. Something is coming from within him. You notice how Zeus withdraws not physically from Olympus but mentally from its noise. He no longer engages the world in the same way. He listens inward more than outward, as if the sky has turned inside him. There is a strange tension in myth here, because Zeus is both origin and observer of what is about to occur. He is not simply a participant in destiny. He is its container, and containers eventually must change shape when what they hold becomes too large. You feel the moment before transformation, like a tightening of reality itself, not explosive, not chaotic, but precise, as if existence is aligning itself along a single unseen point. Some traditions say Zeus calls for aid, others say he isolates himself completely, and a few suggest no one is present at all, that this is one of the rare mythic events that happens without audience, because even gods cannot witness their own transformation fully. And then it happens, not in the way storms happen, not in the way war happens, but in the way inevitability happens when it has delayed itself long enough. Athena is born. You do not see her emerge from the world, because she does not emerge from the world in any ordinary sense. She arrives fully formed, not from womb or earth, but from thought made irreversible. There is no agreement among ancient sources about how this moment appears externally. Some say light fractures from Zeus's head like dawn breaking through stone. Others describe soundless expansion of presence as if intelligence itself has taken physical form. And some insist the event is symbolic entirely, a myth created to explain sudden clarity strategy and wisdom attributed to divine order. But standing here, you feel something more immediate than interpretation. You feel realization becoming presence. Zeus does not move for a long moment, not because he is stunned in the mortal sense, but because he is recalibrating what existence means inside himself. Athena is not like other divine children described in myth. She does not enter the world as vulnerability. She enters as completeness, as if nothing about her requires correction or growth, and that is what unsettles even Olympus. You feel the reaction ripple outward, not panic, not celebration, but recognition that something unprecedented has occurred. A child who is not becoming, but already is. There are traditions that suggest Athena represents pure reason. Others say she embodies divine strategy. And a few interpret her as the manifestation of Zeus's own internal order, externalized into form. Historians of myth continue to debate whether this is literal divine birth or symbolic articulation of intellectual evolution within Greek thought. But none of these interpretations fully remove the emotional impact of the moment, because something has undeniably changed. Zeus looks at her, and in that gaze you sense something complex forming. Not ownership, not control, but recognition of extension, as if part of him has become independent of him. And that realization carries both relief and unease. Because what is born from the mind does not obey in the same way as what is born from the body. You begin to understand the deeper fear that has been growing inside Zeus all along. It is not simply that his children may surpass him. It is that they may represent aspects of him he cannot fully govern. Athena does not move as an infant would. She stands, she observes, and the world adjusts slightly around her presence, as if acknowledging a new axis of understanding. Some traditions say this is where Zeus first smiles without fear attached. Others say he does not smile at all because comprehension replaces emotional reaction entirely, and others suggest something more human beneath divinity. A brief moment of relief that creation did not destroy its creator. You notice Hera's absence in this moment is often emphasized in mythic retellings, and yet her influence lingers indirectly, because every divine birth reshapes relationship structures whether she is present or not. And Zeus now faces something new, not resistance, not prophecy, but reflection. Athena is not a threat in the way Kronos' children once were feared to be. She's not an overthrowing force. She is an articulation of order itself. But even order, when externalized, becomes unpredictable. You feel the myth shift from survival to meaning, from fear of replacement to fear of interpretation. Zeus begins to understand that his children are not simply future challenges. They are expressions of possibility, each one representing a different path reality could take. And Athena represents clarity among those paths, a form of intelligence that does not simply obey structure, but defines it. The silence after her emergence is not empty. It is full of recalibration, as if Olympus itself is deciding how to interpret what has just occurred. Zeus turns slightly, as if feeling the weight of continuity differently now, because this child is not continuation in the same sense as others. She is refinement, and refinement is more dangerous than disruption in subtle ways. Because it does not break order, it improves it, and improvement once begun has no obvious limit. You feel something shift again in Zeus, not fear diminishing, but fear becoming more precise, less about destruction, more about evolution. Athena remains still, observing, listening, existing without hesitation, and in her stillness the future feels less like uncertainty, and more like structure forming itself consciously, and somewhere beyond Olympus, beyond war, beyond even divine comprehension. Prophecy does not react, it adjusts, quietly, as it always does, because even the birth of wisdom does not end destiny, it only redirects it. And Zeus, standing at the center of this new emergence, begins to understand something he has not fully accepted until now. That fear is not always about what comes after you. Sometimes it is about what comes from you. You move through Olympus as if the world itself is learning how to carry more than one kind of destiny at once. Athena's presence has not faded. It lingers in the architecture of thought. And now something else begins to unfold beyond the same sky that once only spoke of war. A different kind of birth, a different kind of tension. Not from thought this time, but from longing pursuit and exile. You feel it first as imbalance in the light. The sun over Olympus does not behave as a simple sphere of fire anymore. It stretches, it lingers, it feels watched, as if even daylight is aware that something is about to be separated into two paths. There are many versions of how Apollo and Artemis come into the world. Some say they are born on a floating island where even the sea holds its breath. Others describe Leto wandering endlessly refused shelter by lands afraid of divine consequence. And a few traditions insist that the myth is less about geography and more about rejection itself becoming part of birth. You walk beside Leto in those stories, not as observer far away, but as presence within her endurance. The air is heavy, not storm heavy, but exhaustion heavy, the kind of weight that builds when the world refuses to allow rest. She moves slowly through lands that turn away from her, mountains that do not welcome her presence, islands that deny her ground, forests that feel suddenly unfamiliar when she approaches. And behind her, something vast and unspoken follows, not enemies in form, but consequences of divine attention. Some traditions say Zeus is absent in this moment, others say he watches without intervening, and a few suggest he is bound by earlier tensions that prevent direct resolution. Historians of myth continue to debate whether this absence is political symbolic or narrative necessity, but what remains consistent is this. Leto is alone in motion, but not alone in meaning, and then at the edge of possibility something changes, not loudly, not dramatically, but decisively. An island receives her, or becomes visible to her, or chooses in some interpretations to allow her existence to anchor there. And here Apollo and Artemis are born, not sequentially in feeling, but split in essence from the first breath. You sense the moment not as a single event, but as division. Apollo arrives with clarity that feels almost unbearable. Artemis arrives with independence that feels already complete. Together they do not feel like children in the ordinary divine sense. They feel like principles taking shape in form. There is no universal agreement in myth about Zeus's immediate reaction. Some say he feels relief, others say recognition, and a few suggest something more complicated. A realization that not all divine children carry the same relationship to fear. Because these children are not threats in the way Kronos once feared. They are not instruments of overthrow. They are expressions of duality, light divided into direction. You walk through Olympus as Apollo's influence begins to echo in the world. The sun feels more defined, more intentional, as if brightness itself has gained awareness of structure. And Artemis, her presence is felt in contrast, in distance, in wilderness that does not ask permission to exist. The forests feel deeper, the night feels more attentive, as if silence has gained agency. You begin to understand something subtle. Zeus is no longer producing only successors. He is producing domains. Each child expands not just lineage, but aspect of reality itself. And this changes everything, because now Zeus is not only king of gods. He is origin point of differentiation. There is a version of myth where Apollo immediately aligns with order, and Artemis aligns with independence. But other traditions suggest both are more fluid in early existence, that their identities settle over time through interaction with world and myth. Historians continue to debate whether divine identity is fixed at birth or shaped through narrative accumulation, and Apollo and Artemis remain central to that debate. You feel Apollo's presence in temples yet to be built, in music yet to be heard, in prophecy that feels structured rather than chaotic, and you feel Artemis in places untouched by human intention, where movement is governed by instinct rather than law, where life exists without needing permission from civilization. Zeus observes both, and something within him shifts again. Not fear in the earlier sense, not paranoia of overthrow, but recognition of multiplicity, because each child now represents not replacement, but expansion, and expansion is harder to control than opposition. You sense Hera watching this development in her own way, not directly intervening, but interpreting, always interpreting, because divine relationships do not remain static under multiplication. They fracture into complexity. There is a subtle tension forming now inside Olympus, not conflict, but interpretation overload, too many meanings emerging from single origin. And Zeus begins to realize something uncomfortable. His fear is no longer singular, it has diversified. He is no longer afraid of one future. He is aware of many futures, each child a branch, each branch a possibility, each possibility a divergence he cannot fully govern. Apollo and Artemis continue to grow in mythic resonance, not as individuals only, but as forces that define boundaries between light and dark, between culture and wilderness, between order and freedom. And Zeus watching them does not intervene, because intervention now feels less like control and more like distortion. You feel the emotional center of the story shift again, from fear of being replaced to fear of being multiplied. There is an omen described in some traditions, that when Apollo first speaks, the sky briefly becomes perfectly clear, and when Artemis moves the forest around, Olympus listens more closely than usual. Historians of myth interpret this as symbolic representation of structured duality emerging in Greek religious thought. But within the narrative itself, it feels immediate, present, lived. Zeus stands between them in awareness, not physically, but conceptually, as the source of divergence that now cannot be reversed. And somewhere deep within him, fear transforms again, less about survival, more about responsibility for what reality becomes through his existence. Because now he understands something irreversible. He is not only father of gods, he is father of differentiation itself. And differentiation, once begun, does not return to simplicity. Apollo and Artemis move outward into myth, and Olympus becomes more complex with every step they take. And Zeus listens to the world in a new way, not for threats, not for prophecy, but for structure forming itself through his lineage. And in that listening, he begins to understand that fear is no longer about what will end him. It is about what will continue because of him. You feel Olympus shift again, but not with the weight of prophecy this time, not with the tension of division or war. This change is lighter, quicker, almost playful in its unpredictability, as if reality itself has learned how to move without announcing its intention first. And Zeus, who has grown accustomed to watching inevitability unfold, now encounters something far more difficult to measure. Uncertainty that moves freely. You notice it first in motion, footsteps that do not linger, shadows that do not settle, a sense that something is always arriving before it should be expected, and always leaving before it can be contained. There are many versions of how Hermes enters existence. Some say he is born in a cave, where wind itself seems to laugh softly against stone. Others suggest he arrives already moving, as if still deciding where to begin. And a few traditions insist his birth is less event than disruption in divine order itself. A reminder that not all children of Zeus are shaped by fear or prophecy. Some are shaped by freedom. You walk through Olympus and feel him before you see him. A shift in attention, a flicker at the edge of perception, as if the world is briefly unsure whether it is being observed or gently misdirected. Zeus becomes aware of him in a different way than his other children. Not through prophecy, not through fear, but through inconsistency. Hermes does not remain still long enough to become defined, and definition in the divine world is usually how beings become understood. Without definition, there is unpredictability, and unpredictability cannot be fully governed. Some traditions describe Hermes as a child who speaks before he is expected to speak. Others say he moves between places that have not yet fully formed in spatial logic. And a few interpretations suggest he represents the boundary between intention and action collapsing into immediacy. You feel his presence in small distortions of order, lost objects that are suddenly found elsewhere, messages that arrive before they are sent, paths that feel slightly shorter when he passes through them. Zeus observes this carefully, not with alarm, not with disapproval, but with something more complex, curiosity mixed with recognition. Because Hermes does not challenge authority directly, he bypasses it, and bypassing is harder to control than opposition. You walk beside Zeus as Hermes moves through Olympus, not always visible, not always present in one location long enough to be tracked, but always influencing movement itself. There is a version of the myth where Hermes invents language in playful experimentation, another where he guides souls without fully committing to ownership of that role, and another where he is simply the embodiment of transition between states of being. None of these fully contain him, which is precisely the point. You notice how Zeus reacts internally rather than externally. He does not command Hermes to stop, because stopping him would require definition, and Hermes resists definition by nature. Instead, Zeus listens, more carefully than before, because Hermes teaches him something subtle, that control is not always lost through force. Sometimes it is dissolved through fluidity, and fluidity cannot be easily opposed. You begin to feel Olympus becoming more complex in structure. Athena introduced clarity, Apollo and Artemis introduced duality, and now Hermes introduces movement that refuses to stabilize. Each child expands Zeus's understanding of what divine existence produces. Not just power, but variation. And variation introduces a new kind of fear, not of destruction, but of unpredictability without endpoint. Some traditions suggest Zeus finds Hermes amusing, others suggest he finds him unsettling, and a few argue that both responses exist simultaneously. Because Hermes cannot be reduced to a single emotional category, you feel Hermes slipping between domains, sky, earth, underworld boundaries in some interpretations, not crossing them violently, but naturally, as if borders are suggestions rather than limits. Zeus begins to understand something deeper, that not all threats arrive as confrontation. Some arrive as flexibility, and flexibility once introduced into a structured system does not remain contained. It spreads. There is a moment described in myth where Hermes returns to Zeus not as child but as messenger, and in that moment roles begin to blur, because messenger implies communication, and communication implies shared authority over meaning. Historians of myth continue to debate whether Hermes represents divine function or narrative necessity, but within the story he represents something more immediate, the inability of structure to remain absolute. You feel Zeus adjusting again, not resisting, not surrendering, but adapting, because adaptation has become necessary for survival of order itself. And this realization adds another layer to his fear, because fear is no longer only about children replacing him. It is about children redefining the rules by which replacement would even be understood. Hermes continues moving, and Olympus begins to feel faster, not chaotic, but accelerated, as if time itself is learning to respond to increased complexity. Zeus watches this carefully, because now he understands something that was not clear during earlier war. Control is not a single act, it is continuous negotiation with change, and Hermes represents change that cannot be paused, only observed. You begin to see the emotional evolution within Zeus, from fear of overthrow to fear of succession, to fear of multiplicity, and now towards something even more subtle, fear of uncontrollable flow. Hermes smiles in some traditions, not maliciously, but lightly, as if aware that existence is less rigid than assumed. And that awareness spreads, because ideas once introduced behave like Hermes himself. They move, they transform, they cannot easily be contained. Zeus does not attempt to stop him. Instead, he watches the structure of Olympus adjust around him. And in that adjustment, something important becomes clear. Even divine order is not fixed. It is negotiated continuously through interaction, and Hermes is teaching that lesson without words. Through movement alone, you feel Olympus now as layered reality, not static kingdom, but system of constantly shifting relationships. And Zeus at the center of it begins to understand the most complex truth yet. His fear is not of children alone. It is of what children introduce into reality itself. Change that cannot be fully predicted, or reversed, or contained. Hermes disappears again into motion, and the world does not close behind him. It continues differently, and Zeus listens, because listening has become the only way to understand what cannot be commanded. You begin to notice a shift in the air above Olympus that feels less like divine activity and more like expansion, not upward, not downward, but outward, as if the influence of Zeus is no longer contained within the halls of gods alone, but beginning to touch the fragile world of mortals beneath it. And in that widening reach, something new begins to form. Not a single child this time, but countless echoes of divine connections scattered across human fate. You stand at the edge of a world that is no longer purely divine or mortal. It is blending, quietly, irreversibly, through unions spoken of in whispers and remembered in fragmented hymns. Mortals touched by gods, mortals changed by proximity to something they cannot fully understand. There are many versions of how these stories begin. Some say Zeus descends in disguise, moving through mortal lives like a passing storm. Others suggest mortals are drawn upward by ambition or destiny itself. And a few traditions insist neither side initiates these encounters fully, that the boundary between divine and human becomes thin enough that intention itself becomes unclear. You walk through villages that exist only in mythic memory, places where fields grow under uncertain blessing, where rivers feel slightly more attentive than usual, where children are born under skies that seem briefly brighter than they should be. And Zeus watches all of it, not from distance, but from awareness that is no longer limited to Olympus, because every mortal divine connection reflects something back to him, not always flattering, not always clear, but always meaningful. Some traditions say these children are called heroes, others say they are accidents of divine attention, and a few suggest they are experiments of fate itself, testing what happens when mortality and divinity overlap. You begin to understand something important. These children are not replacements for Zeus. They are reflections of his influence scattered across time, each one carrying a fragment of divine possibility into fragile human existence. And that fragility changes everything, because mortal lives are brief, but meaning within them intensifies precisely because of that brevity. You feel the emotional contrast here. Olympus is endless, mortals are finite. And in between them, something extraordinary happens. Intensity. Zeus does not fully control these outcomes, and that lack of control becomes increasingly apparent, because divine influence in mortal world does not behave like governance. It behaves like resonance. Some traditions say Zeus is proud of these offspring. Others say he is conflicted, and a few suggest he observes them with a kind of detached curiosity, as if watching variations of himself unfold under different conditions. You walk beside heroes whose stories will later become myth. Some are strong, some are clever, some are doomed from the beginning, and all of them carry something that cannot be separated from Zeus's influence. But here is the subtle tension. Zeus does not determine their outcomes. He only initiates possibilities, and possibilities once released develop their own trajectories. Historians of myth often interpret these stories as reflections of ancient human understanding of fate and personal agency. The idea that greatness is both gifted and struggled for, both divine and mortal. You feel how Olympus reacts internally to this expansion, not with resistance, but with complexity, because Zeus is no longer only ruler of gods. He is now origin point for layered influence across multiple realms of existence. And influence cannot be fully controlled once distributed. There is a recurring theme in these myths. Heroes who struggle not only against monsters or trials, but against expectations created by divine heritage. And Zeus observes this struggle carefully, because it reflects something he is still learning to understand. Responsibility does not end with creation, it extends through consequence. You notice how Hera's presence in these narratives becomes more complex as well. Sometimes she is adversary to mortal children of Zeus. Sometimes she is distant observer. Sometimes her influence is interpreted as structural tension within divine order itself. And interpretation becomes increasingly important, because no single version of these stories remains dominant. They diverge, multiply, resonate differently across time. You begin to feel Olympus itself changing structure again, not physically, but narratively. Because Zeus's influence now exists in layers beyond immediate perception. And that creates something unsettling. He is no longer central only to divine politics. He is embedded in the origin of human exceptionalism itself. Some traditions suggest this is where Zeus's fear transforms again, not toward his children alone, but toward the unpredictability of his own legacy. Because legacy is no longer contained within Olympus, it now lives in mortal action. In mortal struggle, in mortal transformation. And unlike gods, mortals do not remain stable across time. They change quickly. They forget. They reinterpret. You feel Zeus watching this with increasing attention, because unpredictability has now scaled beyond individual beings. It has become cultural, and culture cannot be contained the way war can, or prophecy, or even divine lineage. It spreads. It evolves. It escapes definition. There is a moment described in myth where Zeus observes a hero achieving something unprecedented, not through divine intervention, but through personal endurance. And in that moment, something shifts within him. Not fear, not pride, but recognition of autonomy emerging from his influence. And autonomy, once observed, cannot be unseen. You feel the world becoming more complex with each generation of mortal-divine interaction. Each hero a variation, each story a divergence, each outcome a new interpretation of divine involvement. And Zeus, standing above it all, is no longer simply origin. He is now context. This realization carries weight, because context cannot be controlled, only interpreted. And interpretation, once released into mortal culture, becomes myth itself. You begin to understand something profound about Zeus's evolving fear. It is no longer centered on succession. It is centered on fragmentation, because everything he influences now splits into variations beyond his direct reach. And Olympus, once unified in structure and meaning, now exists as a source of branching realities. Zeus listens to this branching, not trying to stop it, but trying to understand it. And somewhere deep within divine awareness, a question begins forming quietly. If influence continues beyond control, what does authority truly mean? But there is no answer yet. Only expansion, only continuation, only the slow unfolding of consequence across worlds both mortal and divine. You feel Olympus change its tone again, but not through thunder or prophecy. This shift is quieter, more personal, as if the mountain itself is beginning to understand that divine power does not only reshape worlds, it reshapes relationships. And nowhere is that more visible than in the space between Zeus and Hera. You stand within the inner halls of Olympus, where marble reflects torchlight like still water. Everything here feels composed, Controlled, but control is never the same as peace. It is only the appearance of stability held together by awareness of what must not be spoken aloud. Hera moves through these halls differently now, not in anger, not in reaction, but in observation. There is something measured in her silence, as if she is studying a pattern that repeats too often to be coincidence. You walk beside her, though she does not acknowledge your presence directly. She does not need to. Her awareness is elsewhere, focused on something larger than a single moment, a pattern formed through generations of divine consequence. Zeus is not absent from her thoughts. He is constant, but not fixed, shifting, expanding, reappearing in different forms across myth memory and implication. There are traditions that describe Hera as jealous, others describe her as protective of divine order, and a few suggest something more complex, that her reactions are not emotional instability, but structural response to imbalance within divine relationships. You begin to notice how often silence defines her presence, not absence of voice, but deliberate restraint, as if speech itself would give too much power to unresolved tensions. There is a moment in myth where Hera observes Zeus not as husband, but as force, not as partner, but as origin point of unpredictable expansion. And that shift in perception changes everything, because Zeus is no longer defined only by authority. He's defined by multiplication. Every child, every influence, every interaction with mortal and divine realms expands his presence into new directions. And Hera sees all of it, not separately, but collectively, as pattern. You feel the emotional weight of that recognition, because patterns cannot be ignored once they are understood. They only deepen. Some traditions say Hera responds with punishment toward Zeus's mortal offspring. Others say she directs attention toward balance, attempting to restore equilibrium within divine structure. And a few suggest her actions are less about revenge and more about interpretation of order disrupted. Historians of myth continue to debate whether Hera is antagonist or stabilizing force, whether her opposition is emotional or cosmological, whether she reacts to Zeus or to what Zeus represents. You walk through a corridor lined with ancient reliefs depicting divine relationships. Some show harmony, others tension, others transformation, all of them incomplete, and Hera pauses before one of them, not speaking, not touching, just observing, as if the stone remembers more than it shows. You begin to sense something forming beneath her silence, not jealousy in the simple sense, but awareness of dilution, because Zeus is no longer singular in effect. He is distributed across worlds, beings, and outcomes, and distribution changes relationships, because no connection remains isolated anymore. Everything connects outward. Everything echoes. Hera understands this before others fully do, and that understanding isolates her in a way even Olympus does not fully recognize. There is a version of the myth where she confronts Zeus directly, another where she withdraws into ritual silence, and another where she begins shaping divine consequences indirectly through influence on mortal fate. But none of these versions resolve her completely, because Hera, like Zeus, is evolving within a system that is no longer static. You feel the tension between them not as conflict, but as interpretation divergence. They no longer experience the same events in the same meaning. Zeus sees expansion, Hera sees imbalance. Zeus sees continuity, Hera sees fragmentation, and both interpretations are valid within mythic structure, which is precisely what makes resolution impossible. You notice how Hera's silence begins to feel heavier over time, not emotionally heavier, but conceptually heavier, as if unspoken analysis is accumulating within her awareness. And Zeus, far away from this corridor, continues to act across realms of gods and mortals without fully reconciling how those actions are received. There is a moment described in some traditions where Hera's attention shifts toward mortal consequences of divine actions, not directly interfering, but observing outcomes closely, as if studying the long echo of Zeus's influence. Historians interpret this as early mythic articulation of divine justice systems, or symbolic reflection of cultural understanding of consequence and order. But within narrative experience, it feels more intimate, like watching a relationship transform under the pressure of accumulated meaning. You feel Olympus itself becoming more psychologically complex, not simpler as order is established, but more layered, more interpretive, more emotionally distributed, and Hera becomes central to that complexity, because she is one of the few who perceive Zeus not only as ruler, but as evolving system of influence. There is a quiet moment where Hera looks toward the distant sky above Olympus, not searching, not waiting, but measuring, as if trying to understand whether stability is still possible within a structure that continues expanding. And somewhere within Zeus, though not present in this scene, something responds indirectly, not awareness of Hera specifically, but awareness of interpretation itself, that every action now carries multiple meanings depending on perspective, and that realization adds a new layer to divine fear. Because fear is no longer about individual outcomes, it is about multiplicity of truth. You feel Hera's silence settle again, not resolved, but contained, and containment in myth is never permanent, only temporary structure around unresolved tension, and Olympus continues to exist between them, not broken, but increasingly interpretive, because even gods once connected do not remain fixed in meaning. They evolve, they diverge, they become stories that cannot be reduced back into single truth. And in that divergence, something larger than conflict begins to take shape, something quieter, something far more enduring, understanding that even divine relationships are not static. They are ongoing interpretation of shared but differently perceived reality. You feel Olympus begin to quiet in a way that is not peace, but anticipation. Not the anticipation of war, not the anticipation of birth, but something slower, more internal, as if the sky itself has begun to think in longer time spans. And Zeus, for all his power, is no longer only reacting to the world outside him. He is beginning to be shaped by what the world might become within him. You stand in a place that is not fully temple and not fully sky, a threshold space described in myth as existing only during sleep. When gods like mortals are no longer bound by the clarity of waking authority, only by the drifting logic of dreams, Zeus sleeps, and in that sleep, Olympus continues without him in a different way. Not chaos, but reinterpretation. The dream does not begin with imagery, it begins with pressure, a sensation of standing at the center of something vast that has not yet decided its final shape. You feel him standing on a throne made of shifting light, not stable marble, not carved stone, but something that exists only while it is being observed. Below him, the world continues. Rivers move, mountains remain, mortals live their brief burning lives. But something feels subtly misaligned, as if reality is waiting for correction. And above him, movement, not clear figures, not defined shapes, but presence, multiple presences, gathering. There are versions of this dream recorded differently across mythic traditions. Some say it is prophetic, others say it is psychological reflection of divine anxiety, and a few interpret it as symbolic representation of structural instability within cosmic hierarchy. But in every version, one element remains consistent. Children appear, not hostile at first, not violent, but observant, standing at distances that feel deliberate, never rushing, never collapsing into immediacy. You feel Zeus's awareness inside the dream shift. Because this is not unfamiliar. It is continuation of something already experienced while awake, only now it is unfiltered. The children in the dream do not act as single force. They appear as multiplicity, different interpretations of divine inheritance, different potential futures, different outcomes that have not yet chosen resolution. And Zeus cannot determine which one is real. There is Athena, still, composed, unchanging, a presence of clarity that feels like inevitability shaped into thought. There is Apollo, structured light, meaning forming before sound. There is Artemis, distance, wildness that does not request acknowledgement. There is Hermes, movement without anchor, smiling in ways that feel like uncertainty made playful. And there are others, not always named, not always stable in form, but present as possibility. You feel something shift in Zeus now, not fear in the simple sense, but recognition of pattern, because none of them are attacking, None of them are rebelling. None of them are declaring war. They are simply existing. And existence, when multiplied, becomes interpretation pressure. Zeus attempts to speak in the dream, but language does not stabilize. It disperses, as if meaning itself refuses single authority here. Some traditions say this is where he first feels vulnerability as ruler. Others say it is where he first understands that authority cannot fully define outcome. And a few suggest something more unsettling, that he is no longer the center of interpretation, only one node among many. You begin to feel the emotional weight of this moment deepen, because dreams do not obey hierarchy. They obey association, and association does not respect kingship. The children do not approach. They do not retreat. They simply remain, as if waiting for Zeus to understand something without being told directly. And slowly, understanding begins to form, not conclusion, but awareness. That fear is no longer about overthrow, not about Kronos, not about war, not about succession alone. It is about divergence, because every child represents a branch of possibility that does not collapse into a single outcome. And Zeus in this dream begins to see himself not as endpoint, but as origin of branching realities. There is a moment where the throne beneath him destabilizes slightly, not breaking, but acknowledging instability. And Zeus feels it immediately. Not panic, but comprehension. That stability is not guaranteed by power. It is maintained through continuous negotiation with change. The children remain watching, and in their silence something feels almost gentle, not threatening, but unavoidable. Some interpretations say this dream is Zeus confronting future versions of himself. Others say it is symbolic representation of divine legacy becoming uncontrollable in meaning. And a few argue it is narrative mechanism to express transition from authority to system-wide influence. But within experience it feels immediate, personal, unresolved. Zeus tries again to define the moment, but definition fails, because definition requires singularity, and singularity no longer exists here. The dream begins to dissolve at the edges, not collapsing, but dispersing into multiple directions at once. And as it fades, one realization remains behind like echo, not spoken, but understood. That fear does not disappear when prophecy is survived. It evolves when prophecy multiplies. And Zeus awakens, not suddenly, but gradually, as if returning from a space where certainty is no longer available in full form. Olympus is unchanged, but he is not, because something within him has been clarified, not resolved, but made visible. That even divine authority cannot fully unify divergent futures, and somewhere beyond waking thought, the children remain, not as threat, not as comfort, but as continuation, and continuation once seen clearly cannot be unseen again. You feel the story shift again, but not through war or prophecy. This change is quieter, more unsettling in its simplicity, because it does not arrive as an event. It arrives as a realization that has been building for a very long time, and now Zeus can no longer avoid seeing it clearly. You stand beneath Olympus, where the wind moves in long, slow currents carrying fragments of distant prayers and forgotten names. The sky is no longer a battlefield. It is something more complex, a living archive of consequences. And Zeus is beginning to understand that not everything he creates will remain within reach of control. The children are no longer distant concepts. They are present in the world, acting, choosing, existing beyond the boundaries of expectation. And that alone is enough to reshape Olympus in ways no war ever fully did. You walk through halls where divine conversation once felt unified. Now it feels layered, different voices interpreting the same reality in different ways. Even truth begins to fragment under observation. Zeus listens to reports from across realms. Mortals speaking of heroes whose actions exceed explanation, gods observing shifts in balance they cannot fully correct. And in every account, one pattern repeats. Things are no longer behaving as expected. Some traditions say Zeus takes pride in these outcomes. Others say he remains distant, observing without interference. And a few suggest something more complicated, that he's learning to recognize autonomy as a force equal to divinity itself. You feel the emotional tension deepen, Because autonomy cannot be negotiated, it cannot be contained. It only exists, and existence, once established, cannot be reversed without consequence. Athena continues to represent clarity. Apollo continues to shape order through light and structure. Artemis continues to define boundaries between civilization and wilderness. Hermes continues to dissolve fixed pathways entirely, and mortal heroes continue to interpret divine influence in unpredictable ways. Each one exists independently now, but all still trace back to Zeus, not as command, but as origin. And that distinction changes everything. You begin to see what Zeus is truly facing, not opposition, not rebellion, but divergence, a system expanding beyond centralized interpretation. There is a moment described in some traditions where Zeus attempts to understand whether control is still possible, not through force, but through alignment, through understanding each child's nature deeply enough to anticipate outcome. But anticipation is not certainty, and certainty is what he once believed power could provide. You feel him begin to realize something uncomfortable. That knowledge does not scale cleanly with multiplicity. The more paths exist, the less predictable any single outcome becomes. And Olympus itself reflects this shift. Temples remain intact, order remains present, but meaning becomes layered. No longer singular interpretation, but overlapping understandings. Some mortals worship Athena as wisdom, others invoke Apollo for structure, others fear Artemis as wilderness beyond control, others rely on Hermes for transition and escape, and Zeus exists within all of it, not as sole explanation, but as origin point of divergence. You feel Hera's awareness of this complexity deepen as well, not as confrontation, but as recognition that divine influence is no longer centralized. It is distributed, and distribution makes judgment harder, because responsibility becomes shared across outcomes rather than contained within intent. There is a mythic interpretation that says Zeus begins to withdraw slightly during this phase, not physically, but in terms of intervention, allowing outcomes to unfold rather than directly shaping them. Historians debate whether this represents wisdom or limitation, whether restraint is mastery or acknowledgement of diminished control. But within the narrative experience, it feels like adaptation. You notice something subtle. Zeus no longer reacts immediately to every outcome. He observes longer, processes deeper, allows time itself to participate in interpretation, because immediate control is no longer sufficient for systems that have become too complex to contain in single decision. And complexity once reached does not reverse easily. You feel the emotional center of Zeus shift again, not toward fear, not toward pride, but toward comprehension of scale, that what he has created is no longer reducible to hierarchy. It is ecological in divine terms, a system of interacting forces, and systems do not obey singular will. They evolve. There are moments where Zeus watches mortals interpret divine influence in ways he did not intend. Some interpretations elevate, some distort, some simplify, all of them diverge. And divergence becomes the defining feature of his legacy. You begin to understand why earlier fear was never fully resolved, because fear was never about individual children alone. It was about the loss of singular meaning, and now that loss is complete. Zeus is no longer central authority over interpretation. He is origin of multiple interpretive realities, and that realization carries a strange stillness. Not peace, but acceptance of irreversibility. Because what cannot be controlled can still be understood, and understanding becomes the only remaining form of influence that does not collapse under complexity. You feel Olympus settle into this new phase, not stability, but managed multiplicity, and Zeus, standing at the center of it, begins to understand something final about his children. They are not endpoints of prophecy, they are expressions of its expansion, and expansion does not conclude. It continues. In all directions, at once. You feel Olympus grow quieter again, but it is not the quiet of peace. It is the quiet of something that has already decided it will not end. The sky above the mountain holds its light too evenly, as if even day and night are negotiating boundaries they no longer fully trust. And Zeus begins to notice something he cannot ignore anymore. prophecy does not disappear. It changes shape. You walk through corridors lined with ancient stone where inscriptions still glow faintly in torchlight. Some words were carved by hands that no longer exist. Others seem older than language itself, and all of them carry the same feeling beneath their surface. Expectation. There are many versions of prophecy in the world of gods. Some are spoken by oracles in trembling voices. Some arrive in dreams that feel too structured to be random. And some are simply understood without ever being spoken aloud. But Zeus has learned something deeper than their forms. He has learned their persistence. You feel it in him now, not fear of prophecy itself, but awareness that prophecy does not behave like information. It behaves like force. Once introduced into reality, it does not leave, it only redistributes. Some traditions say Zeus once tried to avoid prophecy through control. Others suggest he attempted to interpret it so precisely that it would lose ambiguity. And a few insist he stopped trying to resist it altogether, recognizing that resistance itself becomes part of its fulfillment. You notice how the gods around him begin to act differently in response to this understanding, not more cautiously, but more consciously, as if every action now carries potential alignment with unseen outcomes. Athena's presence represents clarity within prophecy. Apollo represents structure within it. Artemis represents divergence from it. Hermes represents movement through it. And mortal heroes represent its unpredictability once it enters lived experience. Each child of Zeus now interacts with prophecy differently, not opposing it, but interpreting it through their own nature. And Zeus watches all of them, not as controller, but as origin point of multiple interpretive paths. There is a mythic idea repeated in various traditions, that prophecy is not a prediction of future events, but a description of structural inevitability within systems that are already forming. Historians of myth interpret this as ancient attempt to reconcile free will with perceived destiny. But within the narrative, it feels more immediate, more intimate, more inescapable. You begin to understand why prophecy feels like something that never dies. Because even when its specific form is avoided, its structure remains intact. Zeus moves through Olympus differently now. Not faster, not slower, but with awareness of multiplicity behind every moment, every decision branching into unknown interpretations. There is a moment described in myth where he listens to an oracle speak, but the oracle's words do not feel definitive. They feel conditional, as if truth itself has learned to hedge its own certainty. And Zeus realizes something subtle but irreversible. Even divine interpretation is no longer singular. You feel Hera's awareness of this shift deepen again, because prophecy does not affect only outcomes, it affects relationships, because each interpretation creates divergence between those who accept different meanings of the same statement, and divergence within divine relationships creates tension that cannot be resolved through authority alone. You walk through a hall where inscriptions of older prophecies are being reread by younger gods, not changing the words, but changing their emphasis. Their meaning shifts depending on who interprets them, and Zeus observes this without interruption, because interruption no longer guarantees clarity. It only halts expression temporarily. There is a version of the myth where Zeus attempts to define prophecy formally, to give it structure, to limit ambiguity. But other traditions suggest that ambiguity is its essential nature, that removing it would destroy its function entirely. Historians continue to debate whether prophecy is divine communication or cultural reflection of uncertainty, but both interpretations converge on one truth. It cannot be contained. You feel something deeper forming in Zeus now, not fear, not acceptance, but recognition of systemic permanence. Prophecy remains because systems require direction beyond individual will, even divine will, and that realization shifts Zeus's emotional center again. Because fear of prophecy becomes less relevant than understanding its role. It is not an enemy, it is a mechanism, and mechanisms do not vanish when ignored. They continue operating. You notice how silence becomes more meaningful in Olympus now, because silence is no longer absence of information. It is space where interpretation continues without guidance, and Zeus begins to inhabit that silence more often, not to avoid prophecy, but to observe how it behaves when not directly engaged. Some traditions suggest this is where Zeus begins to understand governance differently, not as prevention, but as navigation, because prophecy cannot be stopped, but it can be moved through, and movement becomes the only viable form of interaction left. You feel Olympus stabilize in a strange way, not by eliminating uncertainty, but by incorporating it. And Zeus stands at the center of this incorporated uncertainty, no longer trying to resolve prophecy, but learning to live within its persistence. Because prophecy, once understood fully, is not a message about the future. It is a description of how reality continues to unfold regardless of resistance. And Zeus finally understands. It does not die. It adapts. You feel the story slow here, not because anything ends, but because everything continues for too long to feel urgent anymore. Olympus no longer pulses with war or prophecy in immediate form. Instead, it stretches endlessly, like time itself refusing to offer closure, and Zeus begins to experience something even gods are not fully prepared for. Duration without release. You walk through halls where even footsteps feel repeated, not identical, but similar enough to blur distinction between moments. Marble reflects light that never fully changes. Torches burn without clear beginning or end of cycle. Everything feels suspended inside continuation. Zeus does not age, but he accumulates. And accumulation is not the same as growth. It is layering, memory upon memory, decision upon decision, consequence upon consequence. You feel it inside him now, not physical burden, but temporal burden, the weight of everything that has already happened, and everything still unfolding without end. There are traditions that describe immortality as blessing. Others describe it as punishment disguised as permanence. And a few suggest it is neither, only condition, a state that removes finality from experience. Zeus begins to understand this deeply, because mortals resolve tension through ending, through death, through closure, through transition into something final. But gods do not receive that release. You feel how this changes perception. Every action extends further than it would in mortal context. Every consequence remains active longer than natural cycles allow. Nothing resets. Nothing completes. And children remain central to this experience, because they represent continuation that does not close, each one extending Zeus's influence into domains he cannot fully oversee simultaneously. Athena continues to evolve clarity across civilization and thought. Apollo continues to shape structure in art, prophecy, and order. Artemis continues to define wilderness as boundary without negotiation. Hermes continues to dissolve fixed pathways of meaning. And mortal heroes continue to act within divine echoes they do not fully understand. And Zeus watches all of it, not as controller, not as observer alone, but as enduring source of expanding consequence. There is a version of myth where Zeus begins to feel isolation not from others, but from time itself, because everything around him changes but never concludes. You notice how silence becomes heavier in this section of Olympus. Not empty silence, but saturated silence, full of unspoken outcomes. Some traditions suggest Zeus begins to withdraw periodically, not into absence, but into reflection, periods where he no longer intervenes in unfolding events, only observes them accumulate. Historians of myth interpret this as symbolic representation of leadership fatigue, or philosophical evolution toward non-intervention, or cultural encoding of understanding that systems eventually exceed centralized control. But within narrative experience, it feels more intimate, like consciousness learning its own limits through duration. You feel Zeus begin to understand immortality differently now, not as endless life, but as inability to exit accumulated consequence, because nothing resolves, everything persists, and persistence becomes the defining feature of divine existence. Not victory, not power, but continuation. There is a moment described in myth where Zeus observes a mortal life ending, and for a brief instant he recognizes something he cannot access. Completion, not as loss, but as closure. And closure is something immortals do not possess. You feel that recognition ripple through him. Not envy, not sadness alone, but awareness of structural difference between mortal and divine experience. Mortals resolve narrative, gods extend it, and that distinction reshapes how Zeus understands his children again. Because they are not only extensions of power or prophecy, they are also extensions of continuation without closure, each one representing a path that does not terminate cleanly, each one expanding meaning beyond finite containment. And Zeus begins to feel that expansion not as achievement, but as permanence of responsibility. There is no return to simplicity, no reduction to earlier states, no undoing of what has already been initiated, only ongoing interpretation. You walk through Olympus as it settles into this realization, not dramatically, but gradually, as if the entire structure is learning how to exist under conditions of perpetual consequence. And Zeus stands within it, not overwhelmed, but fully aware, because fear has changed shape once more. It is no longer about what will happen. It is about what will not stop happening. And immortality in that understanding is not endless life. It is endless unfolding. You feel the weight of that truth settle into silence, not heavy in physical sense, but infinite in duration. And Zeus listens, not for prophecy, not for rebellion, but for the absence of conclusion, because there is none, only continuation, only persistence, only the slow, unbroken expansion of everything he has set in motion. And somewhere beyond Olympus, beyond myth, beyond interpretation itself, time continues without offering finality, and Zeus continues with it, because there is no other direction left to move, only forward, without end. You feel Olympus change in a way that is no longer dramatic. No thunder announces it. No prophecy marks it. No war defines it. It is something far quieter, something almost imperceptible at first, as if the world has learned how to speak without sound. And Zeus begins to listen differently. You walk through the highest corridors of Olympus, where even light feels aged, as if it has passed through too many eras of thought. The marble is unchanged, but your perception of it is not. Everything feels slower here now, not weak, not decayed, just settled, like a system that has reached a form it intends to maintain. Zeus is no longer reacting constantly. That is the first thing you notice. He is not absent. He is not withdrawn, but his attention has changed shape. Less interruption, more absorption, less command, more observation. You begin to understand what silence means to him now. It is not emptiness. It is information without distortion, a rare state where nothing is being added to interpretation, only reality itself unfiltered. There are traditions that describe Zeus in this phase as distant, others describe him as contemplative, and a few suggest something more subtle, that he has learned the difference between action and necessity. You stand beside him in moments where nothing happens. And those moments feel more significant than earlier conflicts, because now even non-action carries meaning. Olympus continues to function. Temples are maintained. Rituals proceed. Divine roles remain intact. But beneath it all, something fundamental has changed. The need to constantly correct reality has diminished, not because problems are gone, but because Zeus has begun to recognize that not all variations require intervention. You feel the weight of his awareness shift again, from control to comprehension. And comprehension does not rush. It waits. It listens. It allows patterns to reveal themselves over time, rather than forcing immediate resolution. Some traditions suggest Zeus begins to spend more time observing mortal life indirectly, not interfering, not shaping, but understanding how meaning forms without divine correction. Historians interpret this as philosophical maturity of divine authority, or symbolic reflection of later cultural values about governance and restraint. But within the narrative, it feels more personal, like learning to live beside something you once tried to define too aggressively. You notice how relationships in Olympus evolve under this stillness, not weakening, but stabilizing in new ways. Hera's silence becomes less reactive. Athena's clarity becomes more structural than corrective. Apollo's order becomes less imposed and more observed. Artemis's wilderness remains unchanged because it never depended on intervention. Hermes continues movement unaffected by oversight. And Zeus simply watches them exist, There is a moment described in myth where Zeus hears no prophecy at all, and instead of searching for meaning, he allows silence to remain intact. This is significant because earlier, Zeus would have interpreted silence as hidden warning. Now, he recognizes it as absence of instruction. Not everything is message, not everything is signal. You feel this understanding settle deeper into him, not emotional relief, but structural clarity. There are interpretations among historians of myth that this phase represents the evolution of divine kingship into stewardship, not domination, not resistance, but maintenance of equilibrium. But even equilibrium is not static. It requires continuous adjustment. Just at a subtler level, you walk through Olympus where nothing appears different externally, but everything feels recalibrated internally, as if the system has learned how to self-stabilize in response to complexity. And Zeus becomes the center of that stabilization, not as controller, but as observer of balance. He no longer seeks to eliminate unpredictability. He learns to recognize it as permanent feature of existence, and permanence changes everything, because what cannot be removed must be understood, and what must be understood cannot be rushed. There is a version of the myth where Zeus finally accepts that fear never fully disappears. It only changes focus from survival to structure, from threat to continuity, and in that continuity, he finds something unexpected. Not comfort, but alignment. You feel Olympus breathe differently here, not because it is alive in a new way, but because it is no longer resisting its own complexity. And Zeus listens to that breathing, carefully, quietly, without attempt to interrupt it. Because silence at this stage is not absence of God speaking, it is God's no longer needing to. And that is the most profound transformation yet. You begin to understand what it means to be the king who listens to silence. It is not absence of responsibility. It is awareness that responsibility does not always require expression. Sometimes it requires restraint. Sometimes it requires patience. Sometimes it requires allowing existence to continue without immediate interpretation. And Zeus remains within that understanding, not resolved, but aligned. Because alignment in divine terms is the closest thing to peace that does not end existence. And somewhere beyond Olympus, beyond myth, beyond interpretation, silence continues. Not empty, not final, but ongoing. And Zeus continues to listen. Because there is nothing left that demands interruption, only everything that continues to exist without needing it. You feel Olympus now as something softer than before, not weaker, not diminished, but quiet in a way that suggests it has finally learned how to hold itself without trembling. The sky above no longer presses down with urgency, it simply exists. And in that existence, you sense the final stage of Zeus's long transformation beginning to settle into place. You stand in the highest chamber of Olympus, where light falls through marble columns like slow-moving water. Nothing here is new, and yet nothing feels the same. Time has not changed the structure, but time has changed its meaning. Zeus is present, not as a figure of overwhelming force, not as the storm that once defined him, but as something steadier, something quieter, something that has learned to endure without constant reaction. You notice how he no longer looks for threats in every silence. He no longer assumes absence means warning. He no longer treats uncertainty as enemy. Instead, he listens. Not for command, not for prophecy, but for continuation itself. The children remain, not as events, not as anomalies, but as ongoing expressions of reality shaped through divine origin. Athena, Apollo, Artemis, Hermes, and all mortal echoes born from divine contact, each one continuing forward in their own direction, none of them returning to singularity, none of them collapsing back into origin. And Zeus no longer attempts to pull them together, because he understands now that what has expanded cannot be reversed without breaking what it has become. There are traditions that say this is where Zeus becomes legend rather than ruler. Others say this is where he becomes symbol rather than actor. And a few suggest something more quiet, that he becomes awareness of structure itself. You feel the emotional tone of Olympus soften into reflection, not resolution, not ending, but continuity without resistance. Zeus stands near the edge of a high terrace. Below him, the world continues. Mortals live, die, create meaning, forget meaning, rebuild meaning again, and all of it unfolds without needing divine correction at every turn. There is a stillness in him now that is not emptiness. It is acceptance of multiplicity, acceptance of outcomes he does not directly shape, acceptance of futures that no longer require singular interpretation. And in that acceptance, something releases. Not power, but tension. You realize that the fear which once defined him has not disappeared. It has transformed. It has softened into awareness. Fear of overthrow became fear of succession. Fear of succession became fear of divergence. Fear of divergence became fear of continuation beyond control. And now, it has become understanding. Understanding that nothing in existence remains singular forever. Not gods, not children, not prophecy, not time. Everything branches, everything continues, everything expands beyond its origin point. Zeus is no longer trying to prevent what comes after him. He is learning to exist beside it. There is a final tradition, almost meditative in tone, that describes Zeus not as anxious ruler in later time, but as silent presence within Olympus, who no longer interrupts the flow of existence unless necessary. Historians interpret this as symbolic representation of divine order stabilizing into long-term structure, or cultural reflection of leadership transitioning into observation, or philosophical encoding of acceptance of irreversible complexity. But within the narrative itself, it feels more human than divine, more still than powerful, more aware than controlling. You feel the shadow beneath the crown now. Not darkness, but awareness of everything that crown has produced. Every child, every prophecy, every consequence, every divergence of meaning across time. And Zeus carries that shadow without trying to remove it. Because removal is no longer the goal. Understanding is. The wind moves across Olympus one last time in this journey. Slow, even, unrushed, as if the world has finally agreed to exist without demand for immediate resolution. And Zeus listens, not as king who fears what comes next, but as presence who understands that next is never singular. It will always branch. It will always continue. It will always move beyond the reach of any single will. And in that realization, Olympus does not end. It simply remains, quietly, endlessly, within the unfolding of everything it has already begun. And somewhere beyond the mountain, beyond the myths, beyond even memory itself, the story continues without needing to be closed, because nothing divine ever truly ends. It only becomes something else,